Soon there will be fewer Toys R Us stores in the U.S.
The retailer declared bankruptcy in September and now plans to shutter about 20% of its outlets.
Toys R Us did file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy late last night. A company spokesperson insisting to us this is a balance sheet issue, not a business issue with their overall operations as they seek to restructure more than $5 billion in total debt.
What happens when a company is still making billions, still has customers, still has demand, and still ends up collapsing anyway? If you grew up dragging your parents down every aisle, begging for the toy on the top shelf, you know exactly what store I'm talking about. This wasn't just an American story. Toys R Us was in over 40 countries. Kids in Tokyo, London, Dubai, Manila, they all knew Jeffrey the Giraffe. Now think back for a second. Walking into a Toys R Us didn't feel like going shopping. It felt like entering something bigger. The doors open, and suddenly everything expands. Rows of toys stretching endlessly. Bright colors everywhere. Bikes hanging above you. Shelves packed from floor to ceiling. You didn't go in with a checklist. You just explored. And somehow, that was the entire experience. This wasn't just a store. It felt like a destination. A place built entirely around fun. Which is why what happened next doesn't quite add up. Because Toys R Us didn't disappear when kids stopped wanting toys. The aisles didn't suddenly go quiet. People were still buying, still browsing, still showing up. On the surface, the business still looked alive. So the real question is, how does a company that still works stop working? What if the fall of Toys R Us had less to do with what was happening inside the store, and more to do with something happening far away from it? Because this story isn't just about retail, it's about structure, about what happens when the money inside a business stops being used to improve it, and starts being redirected somewhere else, entirely. To understand that, we need to look at what Toys R Us actually was at its peak. What changed in 2005? What debt quietly does to a business over time? Why competition wasn't the full story? And what all of this reveals about how companies really fail. Because sometimes, a business can look completely fine on the surface, while the ending has already been decided underneath. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is where we dig into the stuff that actually happened behind the headlines. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. At its peak, Toys R Us wasn't a struggling business trying to keep up. It was massive. We're talking about a company doing around $11 billion in revenue, with hundreds of stores spread across the world. This wasn't a niche retailer or a small chain. It was the place you went if you wanted toys. And more importantly, it wasn't just another store. It was a toy superstore. The entire model was built around scale. Bigger stores, bigger selection, more inventory than anyone else could carry. If you were a parent, you didn't need to check multiple places. You just went to Toys R Us. And if you were a toy manufacturer, getting your product on those shelves wasn't just nice, it was essential. The company had leverage. It could influence what sold, what didn't, and what became the next must-have item. That combination, huge selection, strong supplier relationships, and a destination-style experience, made it incredibly powerful. So how does something that big even get into trouble? The answer at first is actually pretty simple. Like every business, Toys R Us had problems. Walmart and Target were starting to sell toys at lower prices, sometimes even using them as loss leaders just to bring people into their stores. At the same time, early online shopping was beginning to change how people browsed and bought. But none of this was unusual. Every company deals with competition. Every company faces shifts in customer behavior. That's why businesses have managers, strategies, and plans to adjust, adapt, and improve over time. The story only really changes when the response stops being about fixing the business and starts being about restructuring it. Because size by itself doesn't protect a company. If anything, it just makes the consequences bigger when something fundamental changes. And at this point in the story, Toys R Us was still strong, but the environment around it was starting to shift. The turning point came in 2005. That's when Toys R Us was taken private in a deal worth about $6.6 billion. A group of private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust, came together and bought the company. On the surface, this looked like a rescue. New owners, new strategy, a chance to reposition the business. But the way the deal was structured is what mattered. This wasn't a typical purchase where investors use mostly their own money. Instead, it was something called a leveraged buyout, which sounds complex, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Instead of paying for the company outright, the buyers borrow a large portion of the money and then place that debt onto the company they just bought. So the company ends up paying for its own acquisition. It's a bit like buying a car and then making the car responsible for paying back the loan. In the case of Toys R Us, that meant taking on roughly $5 billion in debt, and that debt came with a cost, around $400 million a year, in interest payments alone. Now pause for a second and think about that. What happens when a company has to pay hundreds of millions of dollars every single year before it can spend anything on improving the business? Because that's where the real shift happens. Not in headlines, not in branding, but in the flow of money. Before, revenue could be reinvested into stores, pricing, technology, and growth. After the buyout, the order changed. Revenue came in, debt got paid first, and everything else came second. Nothing about the stores instantly collapsed. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. But mechanically, the priorities of the business had been rewritten. And that's the key insight. The company didn't just change owners, it changed purpose. Because from that point forward, Toys R Us wasn't just trying to run a better retail business. It now had a built-in financial obligation that it couldn't ignore and couldn't escape. That $400 million a year didn't just exist on paper. It had to come from somewhere. And in a retail business, there are only so many places money can go. So every year, before Toys R Us could improve its stores, upgrade its systems, invest in pricing, or modernize its experience, a large portion of its cash flow was already committed, not going into the business, but going out, just to service debt. And that matters more than it sounds. Because retail isn't static. It requires constant reinvestment just to stay competitive. Stores need to be refreshed, shelves reorganized, staff trained and retained, systems updated. The entire experience has to keep evolving because customer expectations don't stand still. When that reinvestment slows down, nothing immediately breaks, but things start to drift. It's like maintaining a house while most of your income goes to interest payments. You still live in it. It still works. But over time, the small repairs get delayed. Then the bigger ones. And eventually, the place just feels worn. That's what started happening. Stores became less polished. Layouts felt dated. Staffing was reduced to manage costs. The experience didn't collapse. It just became more basic, less engaging, less memorable. You walk in and think, this used to feel different. Meanwhile, the business starts to feel the effects. Less investment leads to a weaker experience. A weaker experience leads to fewer customers. Fewer customers mean less revenue. And with less revenue, the fixed burden of debt becomes even harder to carry. It builds on itself. Debt rarely destroys a company in a single moment. What it does is restrict options. It limits how quickly a company can respond, how much it can invest, and how far it can adapt. The issue wasn't one big mistake. It was sustained pressure over time, gradually reducing the company's ability to keep up. There's a simple version of this story that gets repeated a lot. Toys R Us lost because of Amazon. And to be fair, there's some truth in that. Online shopping did change how people bought toys. Prices became easier to compare. Convenience improved dramatically. Instead of driving to a store, you could just click a button and have something delivered to your door. That shift affected almost every retailer, not just Toys R Us. But competition by itself doesn't automatically destroy a business. It only becomes a problem if you can't respond. So a better question is, what happens when a company knows exactly what needs to change, but doesn't have the resources to make those changes? Because adapting to competition isn't just about awareness. It requires investment. Building a strong e-commerce platform, improving logistics, upgrading stores, adjusting pricing strategies. These things take time, money, and flexibility. And debt directly limits all three. It slows decision-making. It reduces how much you can invest. It narrows your options. Every move has to be weighed against fixed financial obligations that don't go away. It's like being in a race where everyone else is training, improving, getting faster, and you're running with extra weight you can't put down. So yes, competition increased. That's a fact. And yes, the business needed to adapt. That's also true. But the missing piece is what made that adaptation difficult in the first place. Amazon didn't create the weakness. It exposed it. The pressure came from competition. The constraint came from debt. So if Toys R Us was making billions in revenue, where did all the money actually go? A large portion of it went to servicing debt, not into rebuilding stores, not into improving systems, not into competing more aggressively, but into meeting fixed financial obligations that came from the buyout. And that shift has consequences. Less reinvestment means stores don't evolve. Less flexibility means slower decisions. Less spending means fewer ways to respond when the market changes. Nothing about that happens overnight. There's no single moment where everything breaks. It's gradual, structural, quiet, but consistent. The business keeps running, but it becomes harder and harder to keep up. Because companies don't usually fail the moment customers disappear. They fail when they lose the ability to adapt. And sometimes, a company doesn't lose because people stop wanting it. It loses because it can't afford to get better. And if you want to keep breaking down stories like this, where the numbers behind the business tell a completely different story than what we see on the surface, stick around. All right. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.